At my nephew's party, my sister smirked and declared, "You're just the pathetic one we keep around for money." Everyone laughed. So I got up, walked away, and left them with an unpaid $400 tab that ruined the whole night. I, 32M, never thought family could cut so deep until that night at the upscale restaurant downtown. My nephew was turning 16 and my sister had insisted on celebrating at one of the most expensive places in the city. She'd asked me to help with the cost weeks earlier, and like always, I'd agreed without hesitation. The evening started normally enough. 23 family members packed around 3 large tables, the kind of gathering that should have felt warm and celebratory. My sister sat at the head table with her husband and son, playing the role of the perfect hostess. I'd arrived early to handle the arrangements and make sure everything was set up properly for the party. As the appetizers arrived and wine started flowing, conversation grew louder and more animated. My sister began telling stories about her childhood, the kind that always seemed to paint me as the awkward younger brother who never quite measured up. The family laughed along, and I forced myself to smile, thinking it was just harmless sibling teasing. But something felt different tonight. Her comments grew sharper, more pointed. She mentioned how I'd always been the one trailing behind, never quite successful enough, never quite social enough. The table found her observations hilarious, and she seemed to feed off their laughter, growing bolder with each story. I tried to redirect the conversation toward my nephew, asking about his plans for junior year and his interest in engineering. He seemed genuinely excited to talk about his projects, but my sister quickly steered things back to family anecdotes that somehow always ended with me as the punchline. The main courses arrived and I watched the bill climbing in my head. Steaks, lobster, expensive wine bottles that kept appearing at the tables. I'd agreed to cover the celebration, thinking it would be a modest family dinner. This was turning into something far more elaborate, but I kept quiet. It was my nephew's special day, and I wanted him to enjoy it. As dessert was being served, my sister stood up with her wine glass, announcing she wanted to make toast. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught her face as she smiled, and something in that smile made my stomach tighten. The room grew quiet as family members turned their attention to her. She began talking about family bonds and how we all support each other through different phases of life. Then she looked directly at me and her tone shifted slightly. She talked about how every family has different roles, different members who contribute in different ways. The way she said it made the hair on my neck stand up. Then came the moment that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. She gestured toward me with her wine glass and declared that I was just the pathetic one they kept around for money. The words hit like a physical blow, and a laughter that erupted from the 3 tables felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I sat frozen for several seconds, watching faces around me light up with amusement. These were people I'd helped move apartments, lent money to during tough times, attended their children's graduations and weddings. Now they were laughing at what felt like the cruelest summary of my place in the family I'd ever heard. My nephew looked uncomfortable, glancing between his mother and me with obvious confusion. But even he didn't speak up, and I realized I was completely alone in that moment. Without saying a word, I stood up from my chair. The laughter was still echoing around me as I walked toward the restaurant's exit, my legs feeling strangely steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I heard my sister call after me, asking where I was going, but I didn't turn around. I made it to my car and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The restaurant's windows glowed warmly in the darkness, and I could see the silhouettes of my family still seated around their tables, probably assuming I'd gone to the bathroom or stepped outside for air. Then I pulled out my phone and called the restaurant. When a manager answered, I explained that I was the gentleman who had guaranteed payment for the 3-table party currently in their private dining area. I told him there had been a change of circumstances and I would no longer be covering their bill. He sounded confused and asked me to clarify, so I repeated myself clearly and hung up. I drove home in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. My apartment felt different when I walked in. Quieter somehow, like the evening had shifted something fundamental in my relationship with the world. Update 1. The phone call started about an hour after I got home. First my sister, then my brother-in-law, then various cousins and aunts. They all wanted to know what had happened, why I'd left so suddenly, and most importantly, why the restaurant was now demanding payment from them for a $4,100 bill. My sister's first call was frantic. She insisted she'd been joking, that everyone knew she was just teasing, and that I was being oversensitive. She reminded me that it was her son's birthday and that I was ruining the celebration over a harmless comment. When I didn't respond the way she expected, her tone shifted to anger. She accused me of being vindictive and childish, of punishing the whole family over hurt feelings. I told her calmly that I didn't think her comment was harmless, and that if I was just someone they kept around for money, then perhaps it was time they learned to manage without it. She hung up on me. My brother-in-law called next. Try a different approach. He acknowledged that my sister's comment was inappropriate, but emphasized that they were now stuck with a massive bill they couldn't afford. He mentioned that they have to put on credit cards and asked if I really wanted to cause financial hardship over something said, in poor taste, after too much wine. I found myself explaining to him that this wasn't about one comment. It was about years of feeling like my primary value to the family was financial, and tonight had simply confirmed what I'd suspected for a long time. He listened quietly and said he understood, but asked if we could work something out for the sake of family harmony. The cousin calls were the most illuminating. Several of them admitted they'd felt uncomfortable during my sister's toast, but none had spoken up in the moment. They described the chaos that had erupted when a manager approached their table asking who would be handling payment, and how the celebration had essentially ended as everyone scrambled to figure out how to split an enormous bill they hadn't budgeted for. Apparently, my nephew had been mortified by the whole situation. He'd ended up in the restaurant bathroom, upset that his birthday celebration had turned into a family crisis. Several family members had left without paying their portion, leaving my sister and a few others to handle the full amount. I felt bad for my nephew, but I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. At 32, I finally stood up for myself in a way that felt authentic and decisive. Update 2. 3 days passed before my sister called again, and this time, she sounded different. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like exhaustion. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk things through properly, without other family members involved. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a small cafe neither of us frequented regularly. When I arrived, she was already there, looking older somehow than she had at the restaurant. The confident hostess persona was completely absent. She started by apologizing for her comment, acknowledging that it had been cruel and unnecessary. She explained that she'd been drinking more than usual and had gotten caught up in entertaining the table, but admitted those weren't excuses for what she'd said. She seemed genuinely remorseful, and I found myself wanting to believe her. But then she began talking about the financial aftermath, and I realized the apology was primarily motivated by practical concerns. The restaurant bill had maxed out 2 of their credit cards, and they were facing interest, charges they couldn't afford. She asked if I might consider covering part of the cost, perhaps splitting it with them as a compromise. I told her that I'd been thinking about our relationship over the past few days and had realized that almost every interaction we'd had in recent years involved her asking for financial help. Whether it was contributing to family celebrations, lending money for unexpected expenses, or helping with her son's activities, I'd become the family's unofficial banker. She protested that I'd always offered willingly, and that was true. But I explained that I'd begun to notice how the family dynamics worked. When they needed money, I was included and appreciated. When they were just socializing or making plans that didn't require financial contribution, I was often overlooked or treated as an afterthought. Her comment at the restaurant hadn't created this dynamic. It had simply exposed it with brutal honesty. For once, someone had said out loud what I'd been feeling for years. She sat quietly for several minutes after I finished talking, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Finally, she asked what it would take to repair our relationship. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure it could be repaired, at least not in its previous form. 2 weeks later, my nephew called me directly. This was unusual since we rarely communicated outside of family gatherings, but his voice sounded mature in a way that surprised me. He said he'd been thinking about his birthday dinner and wanted to apologize for not speaking up when his mother made her comment. He told me he'd always looked up to me, especially because I'd helped fund several of his summer programs and school trips over the years. He said he'd never thought of me as just a source of money and was embarrassed that his birthday celebration had ended with me feeling unwelcome in my own family. Then he said something that genuinely shocked me. He'd been saving money from his part-time job and wanted to pay me back for some of the expenses I'd covered for him over the years. He understood that he couldn't repay everything, but he wanted to start somewhere. He asked for my address so he could send me a check. I told him that wasn't necessary, that gifts to family members weren't loans requiring repayment. But he insisted that he'd learned something important that night about how people can be taken for granted, and he didn't want to be someone who did that to others. A week later, I received a check from him for $400, along with a handwritten note explaining that it represented his earnings from the past 2 months and that he planned to continue sending money until he'd covered what he felt he owed. The gesture meant more to me than the money itself. Meanwhile, my sister had been calling weekly, updating me on the financial situation and continuing to ask for help with the restaurant bill. Each conversation felt more strained than the last, and I began to realize that she was struggling to interact with me outside the context of financial assistance. When money wasn't part of the equation, we didn't seem to have much to talk about. Other family members had begun reaching out individually, some to express support for my decision, and others to encourage reconciliation for the sake of family unity. The responses revealed interesting fractures in family relationships I hadn't previously noticed. Several cousins admitted they'd felt similarly used in different ways, and my reaction had prompted them to examine their own boundaries. My brother called unexpectedly and shared that he'd always felt like the family's free labor, constantly asked to help with moves, repairs, and manual work because he was handy with tools. He said watching me walk away from the restaurant had inspired him to start declining some requests and charging for others. The family dynamic that had seemed so stable and traditional was apparently more complex and problematic than any of us had realized. Final update. It's been 3 months since my nephew's birthday dinner, and the family landscape has changed dramatically. My sister and I maintain minimal contact, usually through text messages about logistical matters when family events require coordination. The easy, frequent communication we once had has disappeared entirely. She did eventually pay the restaurant bill, though I learned through other family members that it required help from her in-laws and created ongoing financial stress. She's never directly asked me for money again, but several conversations have included subtle hints about various expenses and difficulties they're facing. My nephew has continued sending me small payments from his job, despite my repeated assurances that it's unnecessary. He's also started initiating conversations that have nothing to do with money, asking about my work, sharing stories from school, and generally treating me like a person rather than a resource. Our relationship has become more genuine than it ever was before. The broader family has essentially split into factions. Some members have continued treating me normally, while others seem uncomfortable around me, as if they're afraid I might suddenly leave them with an unexpected bill. A few have been more direct, expressing disappointment that I'd prioritize my hurt feelings over family loyalty. But there have been unexpected positive changes too. I've been invited to smaller gatherings organized by family members who seem genuinely interested in my company rather than my financial contribution. These events are less elaborate, but feel more authentic, and I've discovered relationships within the family that I'd previously overlooked. I've also started being more selective about financial help within the family. When my cousin needed assistance with car repairs last month, I helped because she'd always treated me with respect and had never taken my generosity for granted. But when my uncle casually mentioned needing help with his vacation expenses, I politely declined, and he seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't automatically available as a funding source. Looking back, I don't regret walking away from that restaurant or leaving them with a bill. It was an expensive lesson for everyone involved, but it forced honest conversations about relationships that had been operating on unspoken and unhealthy assumptions for years. My sister's comment at the restaurant wasn't just cruel, it was accurate in describing how I'd been functioning within the family structure. The difference is that I'm no longer willing to accept that role, and some family members are struggling to relate to me outside of it. I'm still the same person who wants to help people I care about, but now I'm more thoughtful about when and how I offer that help. And I've learned that true family relationships should be built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on the unspoken expectation that some members exist primarily to solve other members' problems. That night at the restaurant cost my sister $400, but it gave me something much more valuable, the knowledge that I deserve better than being kept around for money, and the confidence to demand it. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.